So we move into chapter 11 on weed, grass, marijuana, Mary Jane, and any one of a number of different names out there. Obviously, this drug, for some, is not even considered a drug, and both sides of the political spectrum, as far as whether conservative, liberal, independent, otherwise, different age groups, all look at this drug a little bit differently. Some say it's a gateway drug. It's the way you're going to move on, and that's why it's still listed as a Schedule 1. And then, of course, others say there's absolutely no risk whatsoever to using or smoking weed. Neither is 100% correct, but that's what we're going to talk about. So the actual name for this stuff, cannabis sativa, is the actual name for the hemp plant, which of course has been around for a very, very long period of time because hemp was used to make rope, particularly shipyard rope, because it was relatively impervious to sea salt and seawater and so on. So marijuana itself comes from the leaves itself, not the plant. But cannabis is the actual botanical name for the hemp plant, and marijuana is just the leaves. Now, Spaniards brought this stuff over to the New World in the middle of the 16th century, and by the early 17th century, 1611 actually, English settlers brought it to Jamestown in the first colonies. But we do know this is probably the oldest cultivated plant in the world. As I said, all kinds of different fabrics and fibers are used from the original hemp fibers. So again, English brought it to Jamestown. And within a very short period of time, since everybody, remember, these guys were Puritans, and the work ethic was, you just don't survive off of somebody else. You do your own work, your own survival. And tobacco was, of course, one, but a big one was, of course, the hemp plant. And by 1619, they were all required to grow it. It was considered to be very, very valuable. George Washington grew cannabis on his plantation, and we have writings where he said it made actually better rope. And again, now marijuana comes from the leaves, and the psychoactive factor, which we will talk about, is THC, actually comes from the resin. And how much resin you get depends on where it's grown. If it's hotter and drier, you're going to get more resin. You're going to get less if it's in a more damp climate. Now, cannabinoids include all of the chemical compounds that are contained within the plant, so it's not just THC, so to speak. THC is a cannabinoid, but there are a whole bunch of others. So THC is the chief main active psychoactive compound in marijuana. Its true chemical name is delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol. We leave off the delta-9. THC is obviously just the shortening of the tetrahydrocannabinol. The other one, cannabidiol, CBD, is also found in the resin, has some psychoactive properties just by itself, but it's very limited. And marijuana is considered the most commonly available psychoactive drug. THC runs 1 to 2%, maximum of 6%, depending on how it's grown. When it was first really kind of making its way onto the scene in the 60s and 70s, most of it was coming from Mexico, and the THC level was actually quite low. Now, if they collect the seedless portions of the cannabis plants, no, it's because it's seedless because it was not pollinated. This is known as sinsemilla. And sinsemilla will push the THC levels up quite substantially. Hash showed up when they scraped the resin in and of itself off the leaves instead of mixing the leaves and the resin. Just the resin, dry it out, and just that dried resin is going to push it up to about 25%. Now, if you mix it with oil or mix it with oil and then dry it slightly to produce the crystals, obviously the concentration can go up quite a bit higher. So that's the ingredient that makes people enjoy weed. So, been around for a very, very long time. The first time we actually see a written reference to it comes out of the Chinese emperor in thousands of years ago, many thousands of years ago. Anyways, and it was about more the medicinal powers, and they saw it as a medication for various problems such as rheumatism and gout. They, of course, had no idea what either of these things are or how to deal with them, but they noticed that people got relief. And the same thing with malaria, which was very, very common in that back area. Now, when you shift over to India, it was more of a recreational use. So here we see the beginning of it being used just for enjoyment rather than from a medical form. Their most powerful form in India is in the liquid form. It's called Bhang. And it is almost pure THC, so it's very, very powerful. And there were more than a few others that in various trade routes would get exposed to it. And in the Muslim side of the world, it wasn't banned like alcohol. Hash was born, and it was something that was used by a particular group of warriors. These individuals would become known as Hashishi, and these were Christians, actually, that fought on the side of the Christians throughout the holy wars that were going on across the Middle East. You think of the Knights Templars and so on. And as these guys became very, very good at their job, they actually took on a very specific role, and that was to kill high-ranking leaders of the opposing side. And they would get themselves into kind of a religious and fighting fervor by smoking hash. And that led to the name Hashishi. And in modern terminology, this would be the assassins. The Christians couldn't pronounce the Hashishi and just started calling them assassins. So the cult of assassins, which obviously the modern term still means the same, were warriors that worked to execute whoever their orders told them to execute, and did so by using hash. As people met up with these various individuals, would spread the popularity of marijuana pretty much around the world, coming from what was known then as ancient Persia. We call it Iran now. It made its way as they continued their battles into North Africa. So it would become more and more popular as people tried it and enjoyed the effects or found the effects useful. Now, the Pope wasn't on board with this, and he actually issued what they call a papal bull. It's a document that where he condemned witchcraft, which was a big thing at the time, and the use of hemp, which we are making the assumption it was more along the lines of the plant weed, in the Black Mass. Now, there was no evidence that there was a lot of use this way, but nonetheless, that was one writing that we came across. By 1800, cannabis is kind of spreading around the New World, the Old World, across Europe, so on. For example, the French soldiers brought hash from Egypt. Various other military soldiers from the campaigns in Egypt would spread it elsewhere. And in Paris, in the mid-19th century, around the 1840s, there was a number of different groups that felt hash unleashed their creative abilities. So artists, writers, other intellectuals all started talking about their professions and eating hash, and they actually called themselves the Club des Hashishans, which is the Club of the Hashish Eaters. So it was definitely spreading. Now, in the 20th century, it had kind of fallen apart. Nobody really knew what marijuana was, what hash was, because cotton had replaced hemp as the cash crop across the southern states. It was just kind of forgotten about. Hemp rope was still around, but that was kind of it. It was more about the cotton than anything else. It would be after the turn of the century, during the beginning of Prohibition, that marijuana started making itself known. They call it the marijuana phenomenon. It just, smoking marijuana became far more prominent, and musicians actually started writing songs, which they called reefer songs, and there were many marijuana songs. One was called Sweet Marijuana Brown. And there were places that opened up. You think of an opium den. Well, now we have tea pads, and that's where people would go to smoke marijuana. It was very, very common recreationally amongst jazz musicians and other people within show business. Again, that idea that it opened up their creativity. So as use starts growing by the 1930s, the FBN started saying, wait a minute, no, don't want to start using this. So we start seeing the anti-campaign ads, and of course that opens it up to the American public, because now they're seeing this stuff. And as Mexicans made their way across the border into the southern states, it made people think that they were the ones bringing the marijuana with them, which they did, but they were portrayed as a violent group because of their drug use. So in this still very icky recovery from the Depression, it really wasn't gaining hold yet, made people look for a scapegoat, and it was easy to blame immigrants, as we've seen. And finally, Congress acted. We've got the Tax Act of 37, which did not outlaw marijuana. It simply placed a tax upon it. And it wasn't until the 50s where we start seeing criminal penalties for the use and distribution, manufacturing, and so on. By this time, people had started to begin to believe in the gateway theory, where anyone using marijuana was going to become a full-on drug addict using, cocaine and heroin and various other drugs. So that was kind of a really, really big deal. And as people put bad activities and linked them to marijuana, that fueled more and stronger penalties being passed. And by 69, the Marijuana Tax Act was declared null and void by the U.S. Supreme Court. Since marijuana was illegal to begin with, you can't tax something that's already illegal. So that kind of took care of the Tax Act. So as we move into the 60s, generally there wasn't a whole lot of arrests or seizures of large quantities of the drug. So people didn't really think about it. Where it was starting to increase was on college campuses. You have to remember what's going on in the 60s. It's not just civil rights, but there was that whole anti-establishment movement. Not that we knew who the establishment was, we just knew we were against it. And we did know that anyone in power was part of the establishment, so anti-establishment meant, well, if they said we can't do it, then we need to do it. It needs to be a good thing. And this, of course, was exploding across college campuses. Think of what was going on with the protests, anti-Vietnam, anti-war, the Flower Children, Woodstock, yada, 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 all this stuff that's going on. So this first big major explosion of into the public view is going to happen during these protests, as college kids, hippies, were portrayed as nothing but, dopers that were going to destroy society. So let's move into how it's used, how it works, so on and so forth. And generally, marijuana is smoked, although it can be eaten. You'll find all kinds of recipes on the internet for how to bake marijuana brownies and so on and so forth. But in generally, it's smoked. The cigarette itself is not called a cigarette. It's usually referred to as a joint. Occasionally, the term reefer will come in. That's a rather old term. And how much of a effect it will have depends on how much THC is on it, and even more so, how deeply they inhale it. Do they smoke it like a cigarette where they take it into a very shallow part of the lungs and immediately blow it back out? Or do they take it very deeply and then hang on to it? I can remember seeing people smoking it for the first time, and of course they're choking and gagging, unless they were already a cigarette smoker. But even then, it was so automatic if they were a smoker to take the hit off of the marijuana cigarette and instantly blow it out. And of course, everybody yells at you going, no, 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 you're supposed to hang on to it. So it was almost a little bit of a learned behavior. And what's particularly interesting about this is THC takes its time as far as elimination is concerned. Those who use it on a regular basis, because they already have some in their system, will get high a little bit faster because they're just adding to what they have. And this point that it hangs in the system for a long period of time can really be a big problem. For those of you who are interested in going into law enforcement or any place where you might have to pass a drug test, keep in mind that THC might be found in your system for weeks. And if they test your hair, it can be found even longer. So this is not something that has a short half-life or short elimination life. It takes a long time. So if you're a regular weed user and you go to take a drug test, guess what? It's going to show up. So they smoke, they hold, and it's absorbed through the alveoli in the lungs, little sacs that allow things to cross the blood barrier very, very quickly. And the effects are felt very often even before an experienced user begins to exhale. So it starts to happen very, very quickly. It peaks relatively quickly as well. It lasts 2 to 3 hours as far as feeling it. A couple things that happen. One, the effects are relatively minor from a physiological standpoint. Two things that have been reported is people getting the munchies, getting hungry. I think I've heard that forever. As soon as while they're smoking, they're looking for something to eat. And the other thing is a dry mouth because it dries out the mucous membranes within the mouth. So they'll be wetting their lips. They'll be wanting something to drink. And what's kind of interesting, in Jamaica, where they use a lot of weed, they report that it's used as an appetite suppressant, which is kind of interesting. That's kind of a weird reversal of the use there. However, one thing we have noticed in recent years, 2006 to 2014, is that the number of people entering the emergency room for whatever reason, the number of patients that have entered with THC actually in their system has doubled. So we know there's some link to potential problems. So let's talk about physical reactions here. So again, relatively minor, but the heart will speed up, the eyes get red. You'll almost always find regular users with Visine or some sort of eye drops. They tend to feel a little euphoric, sometimes have the attack of the giggles type of thing. One thing that's unique is that time elongation. In other words, they think they've been sitting there for 5 minutes and it turns out it's been 5 hours. So it's wow. Yeah, they're kind of just so mellow. Anyways, and the hunger, I already mentioned that one. Now, some of the negative sides that are a little more apparent is their attention span and memory levels are definitely affected. They have minimal attention span. You can't keep their attention for more than about 30 seconds. And things don't get laid down in short-term memory. We're not quite sure why, if it just blocks it, but very often what happens while they're smoking, they won't remember. So, because remember, memories are made short-term, and then if they're accessed while they're still short-term for any length of time, then it will be shifted to a long-term memory. And we see some definite impairment there. It also interferes with what we call complex visual motor skills. Operating machinery, which would include driving a car. Somebody counted that when the average person is driving a car and not using their phone, just driving the car, on average, there are 6 to 17 different things going on at any given moment. What each eye is seeing, what each ear is hearing, peripheral vision, what your feet are doing, what your hands are doing, and so on. So there's all kinds of different things going on. And if that ability to take in all the signals that are happening between your senses and then your body movement, your motor skills, obviously short-circuiting that can cause all kinds of problems. We do know that THC binds at very specific receptors in the brain. Anandamide is the chemical that will fit into these receptors normally, but if THC binds into them, then the other one can't. And we notice that there are some people that have what they call endocannabinoids. Endocannabinoids. What are those? Well, that is a cannabinoid that exists on the inside of the person. So it's those cannabinoids that are still there. So all of this is what produces a effect that, while the person may not be aware of it, is continuing to happen for a period of time, even after the high is gone. So some bad effects, acute effects. As I mentioned, hospital emergencies have doubled. Usually it's marijuana in combined with other drugs. When they do the routine tox screen, they come back with marijuana or THCs in there. And one thing that they are looking at is the fact that a person that has a higher level of THC, of course, may be causing some of the more severe problems. Now, on the flip side, we have not known about any case where a person has died just from using marijuana. So the people who think, you're going to take the dope and you're going to die, unlikely. Now, can, for example, that person have a heart problem and they take the drug and it causes a fatal heart arrhythmia? Very possibly, but that doesn't necessarily say that the marijuana did it. So it was a problem that was just probably made worse by the use of marijuana. So from a dependent side, there's a mild psychological dependence. For our first-time users, obviously there isn't. It's not like fentanyl and morphine and OxyContin and whatnot, or even crack for that matter, where we have a tolerance level built and a dependence level built from the very first dose. We certainly don't have that from marijuana. It takes nearly 40 seconds for any kind of a THC level to build up, and while they may be more aware, their ability to sense sights and smells and sounds may be slightly increased. That's it. If they don't try dope again, then that's it. They just kind of walk away and that's it. Now, like I said, doing things that require a lot of concentration and a lot of different skills, visual and motor skills, now you're going to do a lot more poorly. A particular problem that we've noted is that they don't seem to pick up on peripheral information, which, if you're driving a car, knowing that somebody on the side is about to move into you, or someone's braking really hard or sliding sideways, if you can't see that, you're far more likely to get in an accident. And they have calculated that 3 to 7 times higher, which is not a good number. We've already talked about impairments in your attention span and memory skills for the heavier type users. So again here, the brain receptors are stimulated by this use or this presence of THC, and those are the receptors that are part of our short-term memory and motor control issues. I mentioned that anandamide, that's what activates these receptors, and THC stimulates specific neurons in the brain. Don't worry about knowing acubizin or however they pronounce it. I don't even know how to pronounce it. Anyways, but it's similar to other drugs such as heroin, cocaine, and nicotine. These are the feel good, like the stuff. That's why it's important to us. So long-term use, chronic effects. From a tolerance, okay, we know that because the people who have been smoking for a long period of time tend to get a little more high, and they get high a little bit faster. It's not a reverse tolerance, it's just the body recognizing it and doing what it's going to do a little more quickly. Again, we know if they use it over a long period of time, they're going to have THC still in their system, so basically they're adding to it, which is going to help produce these more enhanced effects. Now, withdrawals, on the other hand, yes, we can have some mild withdrawals, physical symptoms, not hard, okay? When they were testing, they had people who smoked a single joint a day for a month and then stopped. They had zero withdrawal symptoms. Chronic users, yeah, they're going to have a little bit more. Some hot flashes, they tend to be a little more irritable. They can be restless. They may have some problems sleeping. So it just depends on how much they're using. And there is evidence to support there's some psychological dependence on it as well. So let's look at some specific effects on parts of the body. So cardiovascular, heart. It definitely increases the heart rate, but this generally is not going to be a problem for a younger, healthy person. They haven't really tested it on the older population, so obviously if a person has, as they get older, they may have issues, or a person that's young that has pre-existing problems, obviously they could have an adverse effect because of that increased strain on the heart. From a lung aspect, things get a little more complicated. Marijuana cigarette, a joint, contains the same amount of tar that a regular cigarette does, but what's bad is a lot more of these hydrocarbons, and of course there's plenty of other contaminants that can be in there other than tobacco. And what they have come back with is smoking one joint equals smoking 5 cigarettes. And you think of say a smoker smokes a pack a day, that means they're smoking 20 cigarettes. Well, that means a lousy 4 joints. If someone smokes 4 joints a day, they're getting the same lung damage as someone who's smoking that full pack a day. And there's plenty of people, obviously, that smoke far more than 4 joints a day. So we can see asthma problems. We can see other kinds of breathing issues. And there's no definitive proof that there's an increase in chronic lung disease. Maybe it's from the fact that they don't continue to use it. Maybe they stopped it. Who knows? But other studies have found the incidence of lung cancer doubled once they controlled for, did the person just smoke marijuana or did they smoke marijuana and tobacco? Now, neither of this is 100% definitive proof. We do know that there is a link between lung cancer and smoking marijuana. The main study that they did was on 40-year-old smokers out of Sweden, and they were 18 to 20 years old, and they followed them throughout their lifetime to see how many of the marijuana smokers developed lung cancer versus the non-smokers, and it was twice as high. So how potent is it? How much do they smoke? There's obviously a whole lot of questions on this. But we do know, obviously, if you're smoking anything, it really doesn't matter what you're smoking. You're taking in contaminants and hydrocarbons. So that means you're going to have a higher incidence of lung cancer. Now, on the immune system, it actually kind of shuts it down a little bit. And that is not a good thing, because that is your main line of defense by your body for any kind of infection or disease. We don't have any good studies on it, so nothing is really clear here. It's not conclusive, but we know it has an impact. How much? We don't know. Now, here's one that always cracked me up when I think back to those wild and crazy 60s and us flower children. It was widely touted that marijuana increased male ability to gain sexual arousal and sexual functioning, meaning they could perform longer and have a greater release than they could when they were off marijuana. And women were of the opinion that it increased orgasmic effects for them. And what we found was hard to measure, because you can't, what is a longer performance for one is not a longer performance for another. So that's kind of hard to prove. But on other sexual functioning of things we can actually measure, men, their testosterone went down, which would kind of decrease the libido. So that kind of threw that one out. Reduces their sperm count, and of the sperm that they are producing, they have more abnormal sperm. So, and that could linger to create some problems. From the women's side of it, if they are of childbearing age, which of course most users are, they saw a lowered production of what they call luteinizing hormone. LH is necessary to release eggs from the ovaries and travel down the fallopian tubes to be fertilized. So if there's no reduction or no release of the eggs, well, it can't get pregnant. We didn't see any increase in birth defects, but we did see of the babies born to a woman who used marijuana, just like a woman who smokes or uses alcohol, we see the birth weight going down and the size of the baby, shorter length, also happening as well. And if they are nursing, if they are breastfeeding, many had difficulty producing milk at all or producing enough to support the child. So from a long-term use here, we know that there are cognitive effects and something we call amotivational syndrome. We have not found any kind of specific brain damage, but this amotivational syndrome is kind of a state of what they call listlessness. It's a little bit of a personality change where they're more apathetic about any kind of a long-range plan. They're indifferent. They don't really care. It just doesn't really matter to them. They don't have the greatest outlook. They don't think ahead. They're just not motivated. So that's what amotivation stands for. As far as actual cognitive issues, they've done numerous tests of individuals while they're taking it. And as we've mentioned, memory issues, and they can stick around for a period of time. We do have some evidence that these kind of deficits, even in heavy users, can be reversed over a long period of abstinence. So whether it actually anything still remains or not is kind of up in the air. The studies are a little bit on both sides of the fence here. So for our regular student users, here's some of the things that we have come across, and we're talking mainly college level users here, is their grades tend to be lower. They're less likely from high school to continue to go on to college. They're more likely to drop out, whether they're in high school or college. And part of it is that amotivational thing. They just don't see a reason. You know what? I'll just sit around and smoke weed. I have no energy. I have no interest in doing anything. Their relationships can suffer as well because they don't want to put any effort into it. Certainly can interfere with work because, you know, if you want to sit there and enjoy your weed rather than actually working, yeah, that kind of interferes with your work product. Their ability to think and plan ahead is just not very, very good. They start losing, the more they use, so they start losing any kind of interest in any other activities that they can't do while they're smoking weed, all of which lead to a less than stellar performance, whether they're at school or in their job. So all of this can be a kind of major problem for someone who uh, is trying to do something with their life other than just sit around and smoke weed. Because if that's all you're going to do, obviously you're not going to get anywhere. Now, I mentioned this way back at the beginning, this idea of the gateway hypothesis, and this was the idea of what impact marijuana had on other drug use. So they separated out into three different things. The first, the fixed sequential relationship. Was there an absolute between the use of marijuana and then going into other drugs? And then the second question was what these people had a risk of using other drugs, and specifically, that likelihood of using other. And then, of course, the causative question, did it actually cause it? And for the sequencing side, which is our first one, we knew and have proven that the majority of users of heroin and cocaine and various other hard drugs have smoked marijuana, they've drank alcohol, and they have smoked cigarettes. So there is a link, but we also know that most marijuana users, or many, let me put it that way, many marijuana users do not move on to hard drugs. So this one's iffy. For our second one, the association, generally people are going to try marijuana first before they go on to heroin. They don't start with heroin. Sorry, I was about to have a sneezing fit there. Anyways, we have found a link that the younger a person is when they first start the use of marijuana, they're more likely to try the harder drugs in the future. So again, we've got a link, but it's not definitive. And our last one, as far as the causation, there's two parts to the argument. There is the intrinsic argument and the sociocultural argument. So let's go over these a little bit more detail here. So, sequencing. We know alcohol and cigarettes come first, and then marijuana comes before other drugs. So we know there is some link, but again, most marijuana users don't go on. So some link, not proof. In our association side, again, the majority of these guys that use hard drugs have started with alcohol, tobacco, then moved their way up to marijuana, and then, on to cocaine, heroin, and so on and so forth. So we know marijuana users are several times, not just one time, several times more likely to go on to other things. However, those that use don't necessarily mean they go on to other drugs. So again, we've got a partial link, not a good one. On our cause side, here's our two arguments. Intrinsic says there's something about marijuana that leads to a physical and or psychological dependence on other drugs. For the most part, this one's kind of awfully hard to prove, and we really haven't found a strong link here. The second one, on the other hand, we've got a lot more support, and that's the sociocultural argument, is that people use simply because they're in a group that use it as well. So, and if somebody in the group decides to try cocaine, well, hey, give it a try. And this goes back, if you think back to your chronological theory, and a big one, of course, would be learning theory or differential association, or there's a number of different theories that'll fit here. But it's about watching someone else use, and someone says, hey, try it. And especially if we're talking a young person, guess what? Now we got peer pressure in there. So can it lead? Yeah, it absolutely can. So we've got some support for this side of it, not so much for the other side. Now, how many people use? Whole bunches, nearly half the U.S. population, and you notice we're talking some pretty young individuals here under the age of 12. There's some evidence of people as young as 8 smoking. Now, the use right now tends to be down, but it goes up and down like a yo-yo. So it just depends on how afraid people are of the use. The more afraid they are of the use, then the actual use goes down. If people think it's safe and it's great and it's wonderful, then their use levels are going to go up. So it just depends. No surprise, young adults are the highest use because this is the group that feels there's the least amount of risk to it. So it is the dominant illicit drug in the U.S., has been, probably will continue to be. But it is one that still has some issues. Okay, from a medical perspective, there's been, if you remember back earlier slide here, when the Chinese were saying that they were using it for arthritis and rheumatism and gout and so on. The medical use of marijuana has been around, again, for thousands of years. But given that so many people in the United States are anti-marijuana, it makes it hard to do the research because your funding comes from a group that wants to prove that marijuana isn't good. Well, that kind of puts researchers in a hard position. So we don't have any good research on how good it is just yet. Now, one thing that it is used for is the treatment of some neurological problems, and MS is a big one. MS is a disease where the immune system attacks the covering for the nerves that control your ability to move. And over time, it's a progressive disease. The person will, in fact, lose their ability to move. There's a lot of pain. And we get people that have used marijuana, not because it's not legal for this use, that say that the spasms in their muscles go down, the pain goes down, so they are claiming a very strong relief from it. And we also know that individuals have used it to relieve pain from cancer and from those who have had a limb amputated. It's known as phantom limb pain. It's a psychological thing, but it's very real and it's very strong. I can remember one patient that lost a leg and was telling people in the room, would someone go down to the morgue pathology where the rest of her leg was held, and would someone scratch the foot because she was having constant, intense itching from a foot that was no longer there. And this is where they said marijuana has been very, very useful. Smoke tends to be better than eating any kind of hash or other types of compounds, but both works. Now, in this cancer thing, we've got another side where marijuana has proven very useful, and that is nausea. People who are on chemotherapy tend to throw up profoundly, which of course they lose their appetite, which makes them lose weight. And it's another issue with AIDS patients and those with Crohn's disease, IBS, irritable bowel syndrome. They have many of the same symptoms. And they have found that THC does help ease the nausea. That's what antiemetic means. It can be used in AIDS patients. They call it wasting because of their lack of ability to eat or keep anything down. It has been useful for them, and the same thing with the Crohn's disease. So there is a number of different medical uses that are slowly becoming more useful, okay? And there's another one, for example, people with narrow angle glaucoma. If the blood vessels in the eye become constricted, you can lose your ability to see, and that's kind of what glaucoma is. And they have found that the smoking marijuana helps with that as well. So there's others that say it helps alleviate seizures. I mean, there's just a whole laundry list of things that people claim marijuana helps with. Some are totally unproven. It's just the patients believe it. Well, is it a placebo effect or is it real? We don't know. And without very controlled double-blind studies, we're not going to know. but those right now are difficult to even get permission to perform. So how good a medical use? Well, we know some exist, but beyond that, we really can't say. Now, obviously, there are disadvantages here. I mean, obviously, if you're smoking, okay, you're taking in all this other stuff. I guess if the person is end-stage cancer, well, they're going to die anyway. So really, they're going to drop dead of lung cancer? Well, they're going to die from their own cancer. So what's the difference? But the problem is it's not soluble in any kind of a injectable format. So it can't be injected. They have some food type items, and then they have the smoking. The legal prescriptions out there, they're Schedule II. They're very tightly controlled. Are dronabinol, which is THC in the sesame seed oil, and the other is a synthetic variation that is known as Nabilone. Anyways, these are the only legal ways to get it. On the other hand, there are many people that just go to their neighborhood friend and get some joints and go about their business. The bad part is that side can end you up in jail where the others can't. So how good is it? Well, it depends on if you live in a state where it's legal. If it's not, you got a problem. Now, as I mentioned, epilepsy, CBD is what's actually proving to be most effective. It's one of those cannabinoids. We mentioned it earlier. It does not have the intoxication properties. So it has been limited approval in the treatment of severe epilepsy, where they have tried the plethora of medications that are available. None of them work. This is a type of epilepsy known as status epilepsy. A person having status epileptic seizures has one seizure after the next, constantly. And the main problem with this is very often during a seizure, a person stops breathing. So whether they're having one seizure after the next without stopping, that's a huge issue. But if they're having constant ones, well, their brain is constantly being deprived of oxygen. So obviously that's not a good thing either. So that's where they will reach for this to try to see if they can get some level drop in the number of seizures, maybe the severity of the seizures, and so on. In general, federal government has not been interested in taking marijuana off of Schedule 1, even to Schedule 2. Their point is we have all this anecdotal evidence on the hazards of smoking, and we have no idea how much people are taking, so we're not going to change it. And I honestly don't think during my lifetime, and maybe yours, that you're going to see this change. It's happening. It will happen, just as if you had asked me in the 60s if they would have ever legalized marijuana in any way, shape, or form, I would have been laughing so hard I would have choked to death. But that has happened. But that's the 60s. That was 60 years ago. So, it may be another 60 years before this change. I'll be long gone. You guys might not be around either. It'll happen, but it's not going to happen soon. So, look at this. And this is why I said what I just said. As of a current, when your textbook was actually printed, only 33 states, 2/3, have approved even medical use. Okay, so we still have 17 states that won't even let you use it medically. And only 10 of the states, so 1/5, have approved it as a recreational use. So we've got a very, very long way to go before this ever has any hope whatsoever of becoming even all states approving it from a medical perspective, let alone recreationally. So if they do approve something medical, it's going to most likely be CBD. In some of those states that have approved it, back to that 33 states, this is the only one that has been approved. There's a mouth spray. It's known as Sativix that does have CBD, but it also has THC, which means it is not FDA approved here in the United States. So we can't use it. Other countries can. But if we see a likelihood that this changes, it's probably going to be CBD. There was a a proposed Marijuana Justice Act in 2018 that amends that original Controlled Substance Act for both marijuana and THC, trying to move it from Schedule 1 and eliminating the criminal penalties. But there has been no move to approve it. So it has sort of kind of died in committee. Again, just don't see it changing much. But if it does, CBD oil is most likely going to be the approval route. So from a decriminalization, not just legalization, okay, 15 states have decriminalized, okay, they haven't gone that full step to legalization, but it's personal use. Less than an ounce, you get a ticket, that's it. There's 10 states that have allowed it to be legalized altogether, only 21 and older. It's not like cigarettes, 18 and older. And again, personal use, so very, very small amounts. You can't use it in public. And even those individuals that are dispensing it like a pharmacy must have a license from the state. So there are people that are heading this route. We know about 80% of Americans favor the use of medical marijuana, okay? But when you bring it down to recreational use, then not so much. Then it starts dropping. We've had, for example, a particular problem with it is the feds are of the opinion it shouldn't be decriminalized or legalized whatsoever. And their laws trump. So what happens if you're at a university that is receiving federal funding? Well, that means that that university has to follow the federal law. So let's talk a little bit about that difference. So while the Department of Justice says they were not going to move forward under medical marijuana in states that have it legalized, the Trump administration rescinded this in 2018. So we're back to prosecuting it at the federal, which means state level as well. So you see how things bounce back and forth. Here's our Marijuana Justice Act. As they tried to reschedule it, would get rid of this whole state-federal thing where the feds say no and the states say yes, but it's right now kind of dead in committee, so it really hasn't moved anywhere. So in 2017, there's your numbers. More than half favor legalizing it. Yet the acceptance rate has really never gone up. So there's still, I think it's going to take a whole nother generation for this to change. Not yours, definitely not mine, before this changes. Now, when it comes to medical marijuana, then there's a lot more support for it. But how much this is going to push the law, excuse me, who knows? As I said, if there's any change, it's going to be the CBD oil, probably more than anything else. And one thing that's still out there is, you know, people tend to believe, or at least half of people tend to believe alcohol is more harmful than marijuana. And to a certain extent, I might agree, because a lot of marijuana users, you know, like I said, that lackadaisical kind of mindset, want to sit in that corner and kind of enjoy themselves. They're not going to go out as much, drive a car and crash into me that the drunk will, because, you know, drunks don't feel they can do anything wrong. I'm kind of on the fence. I'd say they're when it comes to something like intoxicated driving, I'm not in favor of either one. And I think that's probably the position a lot of people take. Don't know. Now, decriminalizing it really hasn't changed anything. People still use if they want to use. But like I mentioned, when it comes to colleges and universities, if they are a public institution, they have to follow federal laws. So even though Colorado, for example, has legalized the use of marijuana for recreational purposes, they have to prohibit it on campus, they have to prosecute it, they have to run with it, or they're going to lose all their federal funding. So that's kind of an issue. And as far as the driving thing, we don't have a breath test. And just because we can smell marijuana, for all, again, we don't know, maybe the guy next to him is smoking, it takes a blood test to detect it. So they're going to have to change how they do roadside tests, or they're going to actually have to take blood right there roadside, or take the person into custody and test it. I don't know how they're going to deal with this. That's not going to be easy, but that's how they're going to finish this is not something really anybody has answered. Okay. And one of the last issues on this ramification side, even from a decriminalization standpoint, those that own, say, a marijuana shop or dispensary or whatever, have had a hard time carrying out any kind of financial business. Why? Because banks, whether it's through loans or anything else, are very often federally backed. So that means they cannot accept their business. So that kind of makes things difficult. If you're running a business, you sort of kind of got to, you get money, you've got to do something with it, which means they have to operate in cash. And that can be obviously a serious problem. And one particular concern is those that bake marijuana into food items, and it makes it very easy to target children, because what kid doesn't want to take a free brownie? So if traffickers are interested in getting after getting a child, well, guess what? They can do that pretty easily just by bringing some brownies to a school. So that's kind of an issue as well. So that is the end of our marijuana chapter. Our next chapter, we move into the, oh, wow, I can fly chapter. So hallucinogens. Anyways.